Imagine a magical being, small in stature but gigantic in courage. A character who started as an antagonist and became one of the most beloved heroes of the Harry Potter saga. But this is not just another superficial character analysis. Today we will dive into the psychological, sociological, and even philosophical depths of the complete story of Dobby, the house elf who defied centuries of tradition and paid the highest price for freedom. And before we continue this epic journey, I need you to do one thing for me. If you are true fans of the Harry Potter universe and want to dive deeply into the details that no one else explores, subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications. Seriously, you won't find this level of analysis anywhere else. And tell me here in the comments, do you think Dobby is the bravest character in the entire saga? Or is there someone who surpasses him? Let's debate this together throughout the video. But this is not just the story of an elf. It is an epic journey about resistance, about how love can flourish even in the most oppressed hearts, about how true nobility does not come from blood, but from the choices we make when no one is watching. It is about how a being programmed to serve managed to reprogram himself to lead. Dobby represents something deeply human and universal, the struggle between conditioning and consciousness, between the security of known oppression and the terror of unknown freedom. He forces us to question fundamental truths. What does it really mean to be free? How much are we willing to sacrifice for this freedom? And perhaps more importantly, how do we recognize when we ourselves are the oppressors? Throughout this journey, we will discover why Dobby is, in fact, the most revolutionary character in the entire saga. You will be surprised by the connections you never noticed before. And I guarantee one thing, when we reach the end of this video, you will never look at Dobby the same way again. Never again will you see that cute elf who appears in the movies. You will see a warrior, a revolutionary, a symbol of hope that transcends the pages of books. So stay until the end, because I saved the most impactful revelations for the final minutes. To truly understand Dobby, we first need to dive into the darkest and most disturbing depths of what it means to be a house elf in the wizarding world. Have you ever stopped to think about the systematic and calculated cruelty behind this tradition? We are talking about an entire magical species, enslaved for millennia, conditioned through dark magic to believe that serving wizarding families is their only reason to exist. The enslavement of house elves is not a historical accident. It is an institution carefully constructed, refined through centuries, and maintained by a complex network of magic, law, and psychological conditioning. Unlike human slavery, which depends on physical force and external coercion, elfish slavery was woven into the very structure of magical reality through ancient rituals that permanently altered the magical biology of this species. Imagine a system so sophisticated that the victims themselves are programmed to defend it passionately. House elves are not just servants, they are magically bound to the families they serve through an ancestral and terrible magic that functions as a psychic parasite. This bond is not just emotional, it is neurological, physiological, existential. When a house elf is gifted to a family, a magical connection is established that alters their fundamental neural structure. Their pleasure centers are rewired to experience ecstasy when serving and agony when disobeying. Their self-preservation instincts are suppressed in favor of an irresistible impulse to protect their masters, even at the cost of their own life. Imagine growing up in a state where questioning an order causes real physical pain, where your own thoughts are monitored and punished, where any impulse of individuality is interpreted by your own brain as a disease that needs to be cured through self-punishment. House elves live in a reality where dissociation is the only form of psychological survival. And it was in this infernal system that Dobby was born, destined to serve not just any wizarding family, but one of the cruelest and most ideologically committed to wizarding supremacy, the Malfoys. Lucius Malfoy did not see Dobby as a sentient being. He saw him as a sophisticated tool, more useful than a broom, more intelligent than a magical portrait, but infinitely more disposable than any inanimate object. Malfoy Manor was not just a house, it was a living laboratory of magical supremacy, where every corridor whispered about the inferiority of everything that was not pure blood. The very walls were enchanted to radiate contempt for inferior creatures. And Dobby grew up breathing this ideological poison, absorbing the subliminal message that his existence was a gracious concession that could be revoked at any time. Dobby woke before dawn, prepared dozens of meals he could never taste, cleaned rooms he could never inhabit, and spent entire nights standing, awaiting orders that might never come. Each meal he prepared was a reminder of his hunger. Each bed he made was a reminder that he would sleep on the floor. Each garment he washed was a reminder of his own forced nudity. The punishments were not just physical, they were psychological, designed to break any vestige of personal dignity. Dobby was forced to punish himself in front of visitors, transforming his humiliation into entertainment for the Malfoy guests. Each slap he gave himself was a performance of his own dehumanization. But here is what makes Dobby truly extraordinary, and what most fans do not realize. Even immersed in this system of total oppression, something inside him remained miraculously intact. A spark of goodness that not even decades of conditioning could extinguish. It was as if his soul kept a secret code that not even he himself could consciously access. There is subtle evidence that Dobby was always different. He prepared food with a care that went beyond obligation, as if he were offering love through the dishes. He cleaned with a meticulousness that bordered on art, as if he were creating beauty in an ugly world. These were microscopic acts of resistance, imperceptible even to himself. Dobby's story echoes with real struggles for liberation throughout human history. Every resistance movement began with someone who refused to accept that oppression was natural, who questioned the system even when it meant questioning themselves. Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Nelson Mandela, all began like Dobby, trapped in systems that seemed inescapable. Without knowing it, Dobby was preparing himself for freedom through decades of observation. He memorized every weakness of the Malfoy system, every routine, every vulnerability. He developed a strategic intelligence that would be crucial later. His oppression inadvertently trained him to be the perfect agent against his own oppressors. And then, on a night like any other, Dobby heard a name that would change his life forever. A name that represented something he never knew could exist, hope. A name that defied everything he had learned about power, about worth, about possibility. Harry Potter. Everything changed when Dobby heard about Harry Potter. Not just as the boy who lived, a title that meant nothing to him initially, but as the living symbol that the impossible was possible. For an elf who had spent his entire life serving a devoted follower of Voldemort, Harry represented a crack in the reality he knew. Imagine what it meant for Dobby to discover that a child, a human child, had defeated the most powerful wizard in history. Not through ancestral lineage, not through accumulated wealth or political connections, but through something Dobby recognized instinctively in his own broken heart: pure love and selfless sacrifice. Dobby saw in Harry something he had never seen in any wizard, someone who had truly suffered, who had been mistreated, rejected, treated as inferior. Harry was not just a distant hero on a pedestal. He was someone Dobby could understand viscerally, someone whose pain echoed with his own in an almost telepathic way. Dobby began to secretly collect any information about Harry Potter. He listened to conversations, memorized newspaper articles, observed reactions when the name was mentioned. He created a mental image of Harry that transcended reality. Harry became a symbol of everything Dobby secretly wished to be: free, brave, loved. And then came the information that shattered Dobby's world. The plans to reopen the Chamber of Secrets. When he discovered that Harry Potter would return to Hogwarts, where he would be used as a sacrificial piece in a deadly game orchestrated by his own master, Dobby faced the greatest existential dilemma of his life. For the first time in his existence, Dobby felt something he could not name: personal responsibility. Not the responsibility imposed by servitude, but the responsibility chosen by love. It was as if a new organ had grown inside him, an organ that hurt when he thought of Harry in danger. Dobby's decision to interfere was not taken lightly. It was a choice that literally tore his own identity in half. Protecting Harry meant disobeying his masters, something that went against not just decades of conditioning, but against the very magical structure of his being. It was like deciding to stop breathing by force of will. Dobby spent weeks without sleeping, fighting an internal civil war. Every fibre of his conditioning screamed that he was wrong, that he was being dangerous, that he was betraying not just his masters, but his own nature. His hands bled from hitting himself so much, his body trembled constantly, his magic became uncontrolled. But a small and persistent voice whispered that perhaps, just perhaps, he could be more than just a servant. Perhaps there was a version of himself he did not know, a version that could choose, that could act, that could matter. It was such a radical idea that it hurt to think about it. Let us dissect that iconic scene in Harry's room at Grimmauld Place with new eyes. Dobby did not appear as a gracious savior. He appeared as a creature at war with himself, each word costing him physical pain. Each syllable he said against the Malfoys was followed by brutal self-punishment, because his programming interpreted any criticism of his masters as fundamental betrayal. Each slap Dobby gave himself was an epic battle condensed into a second. It was his emerging consciousness fighting against centuries of ancestral programming. It was freedom trying to be born through layers of oppression. It was revolution happening in slow motion, cell by cell. Dobby could not speak directly about the plans. His magic would not allow it. The words literally died in his throat. So he had to communicate through desperate clues, through actions he hoped Harry could decipher. It was like trying to scream through a magical gag that tightened more with each attempt. Each warning Dobby gave was also a cry for help. He was not just protecting Harry, he was begging for Harry to save him from himself, to free him from the cycle of self-punishment he could not break alone. It was an SOS encoded in every desperate gesture. Dobby's courage was not the heroic courage of adventure books. It was the courage of absolute desperation, the courage of someone who finally found something more important than his own sanity. He was not being brave, he was being impossible to stop, driven by a force that transcended fear. And then came the moment that would change everything. A moment that would not only free Dobby, but would echo through all magical history. A moment that would prove that sometimes the smallest gestures have the greatest consequences. But are you prepared to discover that this liberation was only the beginning of an even more dangerous journey? The moment when Harry handed that seemingly insignificant sock to Dobby was not just a clever trick. It was an act of liberation that echoed through multiple dimensions of magical reality. For the first time in centuries, perhaps millennia, a house elf was freed not by carelessness, death of the master, or abandonment, but by a deliberate act of recognition and compassion. What Harry did transcended the mere delivery of a piece of clothing. He performed, unknowingly, an ancestral magical ritual that recognized Dobby as a being capable of ownership, of dignity, of independent existence. The sock was not just an object. It was a magical symbol that declared to the universe that Dobby had intrinsic value. When Dobby held that sock, something fundamental changed in the structure of reality around him. The magical chains that bound him did not just break, they dissolved retroactively, as if they had never existed. It was as if the universe finally admitted that elfish slavery had been a cosmic mistake that needed to be corrected. Dobby's transformation was more than psychological, it was literally physical. His posture changed, his eyes shone differently, his voice gained a quality it did not possess before. It was as if decades of forced curvature were suddenly corrected, as if he grew several inches in seconds. The power Dobby demonstrated in confronting Lucius Malfoy was not just magical, it was existential. For the first time in his life, he spoke as an equal, looked into the eyes of his former torturer without lowering his head, without trembling, without preparing for pain. It was a personal revolution, condensed into seconds, that was worth decades of evolution. When Dobby threw Lucius Malfoy against the wall, he was not just using magic. He was channeling decades of repressed anger, of accumulated humiliation, of pain transformed into power. Each spell carried the weight of every injustice suffered. Each word spoken carried the authority of someone who finally found their voice. But freedom brought a terrifying challenge that Dobby did not anticipate. He had spent his entire life defined by his servitude. His identity was completely intertwined with his function. Who was he without the Malfoys? How does a being conditioned to obey find purpose in freedom? It was like waking from a dream that lasted decades and discovering you do not know who you are. Imagine waking up one day and discovering that everything you believed about yourself was a carefully constructed lie. Dobby did not just gain freedom, he lost his entire identity. His personality, his tastes, his fears, his dreams, everything had been defined in relation to servitude. Without it, he was a terrifying blank canvas. The first days of freedom were more terrifying than any punishment he had received. Dobby had to learn to make decisions, something he had never done. He had to discover his own desires, his own values, his own voice. It was like learning to walk again, but this time with the soul. Dobby's relationship with Winky revealed something deeply tragic about social change. Winky, recently freed against her will, was literally being destroyed by the loss of her identity as a servant. She did not see freedom as a gift, but as cruel punishment, as amputation of her own soul. Other elves at Hogwarts saw Dobby as a traitor, a mentally ill being, someone who had lost his elfish essence. He was alone among his own, misunderstood, for wanting something they did not even know they could desire. It was the terrible price of evolution, being rejected by those you most wanted to liberate. Dobby discovered that freedom can be the deepest of solitudes. He no longer belonged to the world of house elves, but he also did not belong to the world of wizards. He was a stranger in both worlds, a pioneer walking through uncharted territory without a map or company. Dobby's eccentric clothes were not just a comic peculiarity, they were a radical political statement. Each mismatched sock, each colorful hat, each bizarre combination was an affirmation of individuality, a refusal to conform to expectations about how an elf should dress. It was art as resistance. When Dobby began working at Hogwarts, he was not just getting a job, he was redefining what it meant to be a house elf. He showed that it was possible to serve by choice, not by compulsion. That dignity and work could coexist. Dobby became a bridge between two worlds, the world of the oppressed and the world of the oppressors. He showed that change was not just possible, but inevitable. His presence at Hogwarts was not just about having a free elf. It was about hope becoming tangible reality. And then, when the shadows of war began to spread across the wizarding world, Dobby faced a choice that would define not just his destiny, but the destiny of everyone he loved. It was time to discover if a freed house elf could become something even more impossible, a warrior. When the Second Wizarding War began to take shape on the horizon like an inevitable storm, Dobby did not hesitate for a single second in choosing his side. He did not fight out of patriotic obligation, fear of reprisals, or blind loyalty to charismatic leaders. He fought for something much more powerful and dangerous: conscious love and deliberate choice. Dobby's metamorphosis from oppressed servant to freedom fighter was not just psychological. It was a complete revolution of identity that defied the very laws of magical nature. He took all the skills he had developed to serve and redirected them to resist. It was as if he had learned to use his broken chains as weapons. Dobby possessed unique advantages as a resistance agent that not even the most trained aurors could replicate. His elfish magic allowed him to appear and disappear anywhere without being detected by conventional security systems. His harmless appearance made him virtually invisible in the eyes of wizarding supremacists who could not conceive of a threat coming from an inferior creature. Dobby developed an intelligence network that would make the most sophisticated secret services jealous. He recruited house elves from families sympathetic to the Death Eaters, marginalized magical creatures, and even magical portraits that had been silent witnesses to secret conversations for decades. His sabotage operations were masterpieces in psychological engineering. Dobby did not just destroy property, he demoralized enemies. Each action was calculated to show the Death Eaters that not even their own homes were safe, that the Resistance had eyes and ears in places they would never imagine. Dobby learned to navigate moral dilemmas that would make philosophers hesitate. He had to choose between saving individual lives and serving the greater good. He had to decide when to use violence and when to use compassion. He had to learn that sometimes goodness requires toughness. These were not decisions a conditioned servant could make. They were choices of a moral leader. During the darkest months of the war, Dobby became a legendary ghost among the Death Eaters. Important documents disappeared. Secret meetings were mysteriously interrupted, and even Voldemort began to suspect there was a spy in his inner circle. It never occurred to him that the spy was an inferior house elf. Dobby understood something that many experienced warriors do not understand, that the most important war is fought in the mind. He used his harmless appearance to sow paranoia among enemies. Death Eaters began to suspect each other, to question loyalties, to see betrayal where there was none. As the war intensified, Dobby prepared himself for what he sensed would be his final test. He knew a moment would come when he would have to choose between his personal safety and the protection of those he loved. And unlike his previous life, where such choices were imposed, now he knew exactly what decision he would make. When Dobby learned that Harry had been captured and taken to Malfoy Manor, he faced the greatest challenge of his transformation. He would have to return to the place of his greatest trauma, face not just physical dangers, but psychological ghosts that had haunted every day of his previous life. Malfoy Manor was not just a dangerous place for Dobby. It was the epicenter of all his deepest nightmares. Every corridor held memories of humiliation and physical pain. Every shadow whispered about his supposed inferiority. Every stone in the walls echoed with decades of brutal conditioning. But Dobby made this impossible choice knowing exactly what it meant. He was not being impulsive, desperate, or unconscious of the consequences. He was making a conscious and calculated choice to prioritize the well-being of others over his own psychological stability. It was the decision of a truly mature hero. Dobby's journey back to Malfoy Manor was not just physical, it was spiritual. He was not just returning to a place, he was returning to a version of himself that he had completely transcended. It was as if a butterfly decided to voluntarily return to the cocoon, not to regress, but to prove that the metamorphosis had been real and irreversible. In the final moments before apparating to the manor, Dobby did something he had never done before. He prepared himself mentally, not as a servant returning home, but as a warrior invading enemy territory. He visualized every corridor, every trap, every possible confrontation. But more importantly, he visualized himself as he was now, free, powerful, choosing to be there. And then, when Dobby appeared at Malfoy Manor to rescue Harry, Luna and the others, he was no longer the same elf who had left that place years before. He arrived as a force of nature, as a tsunami of freedom invading a temple of oppression. His very presence there defied the fundamental laws that governed that space. What happened at Malfoy Manor during those final minutes of Dobby's life transcended any conventional definition of heroism. It was not just a successful rescue. It was the culmination of an epic journey of self-discovery, an act of love so pure that it literally rewrote the laws of magical reality around him. When Dobby appeared in that dungeon, he was not just saving prisoners. He was symbolically confronting everything that had tried to destroy him. Each friend he freed represented a part of himself that had been imprisoned. Each chain he broke echoed with the invisible chains he had carried for decades. The look Dobby exchanged with Harry in that moment carried the weight of their entire history together. Harry saw in Dobby's eyes no longer the desperate elf he had known, but a warrior who had consciously chosen to risk everything for love. It was a moment of mutual recognition between two survivors who had become saviors. When Dobby faced Bellatrix Lestrange and the other Death Eaters, he was not just fighting external enemies. He was fighting centuries of conditioning that whispered he had no right to resist. Each spell he conjured was a declaration of war against his own ancestral programming. Bellatrix's stabbing was not just a physical wound. It was a desperate attempt to reassert the old order, to prove that house elves could not transcend their designated place. But even as the blade pierced his flesh, Dobby remained focused on completing the rescue. The physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional pain he had carried for decades. Dobby is a free elf. These final words were not just a declaration of identity. They were a declaration of existential victory. He did not say was a free elf. He said is. Even facing death, he affirmed that his freedom had become an eternal truth, something not even death could erase. Dobby died on a beach, with his bare feet in the sand, under the open sky. Everything the opposite of the claustrophobic manor where he had lived enslaved. It was as if he had unconsciously orchestrated his own final freedom, dying in a place that represented infinity and possibility. Dobby's death was not just the loss of a beloved character, it was the loss of a living symbol that change was possible. His death forced everyone who knew him to confront their own self-imposed limitations and question what other impossible transformations might be waiting to be discovered. Dobby proved that true nobility does not come from lineage or wealth, but from conscious choices made in the moment when no one is watching. He showed that real power is not in dominating others, but in freeing ourselves from the chains we carry without realizing. And so we end this epic journey through Dobby's life, but his story does not end with his death. It continues in every act of resistance against oppression, in every courageous choice to be free, in every moment when someone decides that being truly human or elfish means choosing love over fear, compassion over cruelty, hope over despair. Dobby was not just a house elf who became free. He was an eternal symbol that the most impossible transformation is always possible, that love can overcome any conditioning, that true magic is not in spells or wands, but in the courage to choose to be who we really are. So I ask again, do you still think Dobby was just a cute secondary character, or do you now see, as I do, that he was perhaps the greatest hero of the entire saga? Not despite his humble origin, but because of it. An elf who taught us that true magic is in choosing to be free, even when it costs everything. Dobby, the free elf, lives forever in all of us who choose to resist, who choose to love, who choose to be more than the world tells us we can be. His story is not about magic, it is about humanity, and perhaps that is why we will never be able to forget him. Dobby is a free elf forever.